Farmer found a massive sinkhole after the storm. What was at the bottom made him rich. John Maxwell had always been a man of the land, spending his days working the soil of his modest farm in a small, quiet town. The town was known for its peace, its greenery, and its friendly people. The locals were all familiar faces, and John, a farmer for as long as anyone could remember, had a reputation for being hard-working and kind-hearted. His farm had been in the family for generations, passed down from his great-grandfather, and although it wasn't the largest farm in the area, it was a source of pride for John. However, like many farmers, John's life wasn't always easy. The seasons were unpredictable, and farming was always a gamble. Some years the crops thrived, but others, like this one, the weather had not been kind. John had watched helplessly as his crops wilted under the harsh summer heat and as the water tables ran dry. He had put everything he had into this farm, but it seemed like the land was becoming less forgiving each year. Yet, despite these hardships, John never gave up. He believed in the land, and he was determined to make it work. That year, the weather had turned worse than anyone had anticipated. A powerful storm, something no one had expected, rolled into town late in the evening, bringing with it heavy rains, high winds, and thunder that rattled the windows of every home. It was the kind of storm that made people hurry to close their windows and doors, not knowing if they would be safe until it passed. John had heard weather warnings all day, but like many others, he thought it wouldn't be as bad as the forecasters predicted. As the storm raged on, John stayed in his farmhouse, keeping an eye on the rain as it poured down in sheets, flooding the fields and creating rivers where they didn't belong. He checked on his animals, making sure they were safe in their pens, and tried his best to secure what he could. But the storm wasn't going to let up. It felt as if the very sky was opening up, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. By the time midnight came, the storm had reached its peak. The wind howled through the trees, bending them low, and the rain lashed against the house in unrelenting sheets. John tried to get some rest, but sleep was impossible with the storm making its presence felt. The sound of the wind outside, the creaking of the barn, and the rumble of thunder kept him awake for hours. When morning finally came, the storm had passed, but the damage was evident. The world outside looked different, as if nature itself had decided to start fresh. The sun, still struggling to break through the clouds, cast a pale light over the land. John slowly made his way outside to survey the damage. His boots squelched as he walked through the mud, the land now a battlefield of overturned trees, flooded fields, and debris scattered everywhere. It was as if the storm had left its mark on everything it touched. The sky was still heavy with clouds, and the air smelled of wet earth and rain. John walked through the yard, his eyes scanning the damage. The crops, most of which were already struggling, had been battered by the storm. The rows of vegetables he had been tending for months were now lost. His heart sank as he saw the damage to his land. It wasn't just the crops. His barn, which had been sturdy and reliable for decades, had taken a beating. The roof was damaged, and some of the walls had buckled. The heavy rain had seeped into his storage areas, ruining much of his supplies. The storm had not been kind to him, but there was nothing to do except pick up the pieces and start again. John trudged toward the back of his farm, where the land met the forest. He knew the terrain well, and he had always found solace in the quiet corners of his property. As he walked, something unusual caught his eye. The ground ahead of him seemed different. The earth was unsettled, and there was a large, jagged crack running across the field. It didn't make sense. The land was flat here. How could there be a crack? John approached cautiously, squinting to see what was happening. As he got closer, his heart skipped a beat. There, in the middle of his field, was a massive sinkhole. The hole seemed to have appeared overnight, and it was enormous. The edges of the sinkhole were rough, as if the earth had suddenly caved in, leaving behind a chasm where none had been before. The hole itself was deep, and the edges seemed to shift as if the ground around it was still settling. The storm had obviously caused it, but John couldn't believe his eyes. The sinkhole was unlike anything he had ever seen. The earth around the hole was cracked, and the surface seemed unstable. The hole itself seemed to go on forever, as if it led to another world beneath the ground. John stood there for a moment, shocked, trying to understand what had happened. It was a strange feeling, seeing something so out of place on his land. The sinkhole was huge, and it looked like it had swallowed up part of the field, tearing through the soil like it was made of paper. He was no stranger to the occasional small sinkhole or erosion, but this was something else. John took a few steps closer, his mind racing. What could be at the bottom of this sinkhole? He had no idea, but the curiosity inside him was already starting to outweigh his caution. He had to know. The ground around the hole was unstable, and John knew better than to get too close. But something in him wanted to see what lay beneath, even though he couldn't yet explain why. He took a step back and headed to the farmhouse to get his tools. He wasn't going to jump in blindly, but he needed to find out if there was any danger. As he went to fetch his shovel and some ropes, John couldn't help but think that the hole might just be a natural consequence of the storm's fury. After all, storms did strange things to the earth. But this felt different. It felt important. When he returned, he carefully approached the sinkhole again, his mind racing with questions. He had no idea what could be at the bottom. A part of him feared it could be something dangerous, like a hidden cavern or an underground river. But the other part of him, the one that had always been curious, was itching to know more. So, with a steady breath, he lowered himself to the edge of the sinkhole, ready to start his investigation. But what he found next would change his life forever. John Maxwell stood at the edge of the sinkhole, the sound of the earth settling still echoing in his ears. He had never seen anything like it before. The hole was vast, much larger than he had initially thought. The edges were jagged, as if the ground had cracked open in a violent rush. The soil around it was damp from the storm, and the air still felt heavy with the remnants of the downpour. A strange unease settled in John's chest, but his curiosity urged him to take another step closer. He carefully examined the area around the sinkhole, trying to understand what had happened. It was clear that the storm had caused the ground to collapse, but John couldn't shake the feeling that something more was at play here. The hole itself seemed unnatural, as if it had appeared too suddenly and too violently to be a simple result of the rain. He looked down into the dark, empty depths, but it was difficult to see much beyond the first few feet. The sides of the sinkhole were too steep to allow for any clear view of what lay below. The sunlight barely reached the bottom, casting the area into shadow. Despite the uncertainty and the risk, John knew he couldn't just leave this mystery unresolved. His hands shook slightly as he set down his tools. He knew he should be careful. The earth around the sinkhole was unstable, and there could be dangers hidden beneath the surface. Still, the pull of curiosity was too strong to ignore. He decided he would need to get a better look. If there was something hidden at the bottom, he wanted to find out, but he needed to be smart about it. John made his way back to the farmhouse to grab some more tools. His mind raced as he walked through the mud, the storm's aftermath still all around him. He grabbed a rope and a sturdy flashlight. If he was going to get close enough to inspect the bottom, he'd need both. The flashlight would help him see better, and the rope would give him some security, in case he needed to climb down. He wasn't sure what he was about to find, but he was determined to understand what had caused the ground to collapse like this. When he returned to the sinkhole, John paused for a moment, standing a few feet away from the edge. He felt a mix of excitement and caution. The land was his livelihood, his connection to everything he knew, and something about this hole felt deeply wrong. But then again, if there was something worth finding, if there was something valuable at the bottom, it might change his entire life. His farm, which had been struggling for so long, could be saved with just the right discovery. He took a deep breath and tied the rope to a sturdy tree nearby, making sure it was secure. John knew that safety was important, and if he was going to go down into the hole, he couldn't afford to be reckless. He looked down at the hole again. It was deep. Deeper than he had expected. He could barely make out the bottom, and the shadows seemed to stretch further than he could see. The earth around the sinkhole was fragile, and the last thing he wanted was to fall in. John steadied his nerves, reminding himself that he had dealt with tougher situations on the farm. He had worked through droughts, floods, and poor harvests, and he wasn't one to shy away from hard work. This, however, was different. This was an unknown. Taking the flashlight in hand, John slowly lowered the rope into the sinkhole. The beam of light flickered for a moment before shining straight down, casting a pale, yellow glow across the sides of the hole. The walls seemed rough, and the dirt looked loose, as if the land hadn't settled yet. John tied the rope securely to his waist and began his descent. The feeling of climbing down into the sinkhole was like nothing he had experienced before. The air grew cooler as he descended, and a strange stillness settled around him. The only sound was the faint rustling of the rope against the sides of the hole as he made his way down. Each step was careful, slow, as John tried to gauge the stability of the ground beneath him. The rope groaned slightly, but it held firm. As he reached the halfway point, John shone the flashlight further down. What he saw made him stop for a moment. At the bottom, just visible in the dim light, was something that didn't belong. Among the rocks and dirt, there was something shiny, something metallic. John's heart skipped a beat. What was it? The sight of it stirred something deep within him. Could it be some kind of artifact, or maybe a piece of old machinery? His pulse quickened, but John knew he couldn't let his excitement get the best of him. He had to keep his wits about him. Carefully, he descended further. The rope creaked as he neared the bottom, and with a soft thud, his feet finally touched the ground. He stood still for a moment, gathering his bearings. The air was different down here, musty and cool, with the faint smell of earth and metal. He had no idea what to expect, but he knew he was on the brink of discovering something big. John turned the flashlight toward the shiny object he had seen earlier. As the beam of light illuminated it, he realized it wasn't just one object, it was several. In the dim glow, he saw what looked like large metal coins, tarnished and old, scattered across the ground. They were unlike any coins John had ever seen before. Their design was strange, their edges worn smooth by time. There were also other objects, pottery fragments, small sculptures, and broken pieces of what appeared to be jewelry. John's breath caught in his throat. Could these items be from an ancient civilization? He had no way of knowing, but it was clear that what he had found was more than just debris from the storm. His eyes widened as he realized the full extent of what was before him. These weren't just random pieces of metal and stone. This was something of historical significance. John felt the weight of the discovery settle over him. His farm, which had once been his source of struggle, could now be the source of something extraordinary. He stepped forward carefully, avoiding the fragile pottery and the scattered coins. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. It was as if the earth had kept these treasures hidden for centuries, waiting for someone to stumble upon them. And now, that someone was him. John knew that he had to tread carefully. He had no idea what to do with this discovery. Should he take the objects back with him, or should he leave them here for experts to examine? The thought of selling the items crossed his mind briefly, but he wasn't sure who would even believe him if he told them what he had found. As he stood there, surrounded by these ancient relics, John realized that his life had just changed forever. Whatever these items were, they were going to alter the course of his future. The question now was, what would he do next? John stood at the bottom of the sinkhole, his heart racing with a mix of awe and disbelief. The strange, metallic coins and the broken pieces of pottery scattered before him felt like they belonged to another time, a time long forgotten. He bent down, carefully picking up a few of the objects to inspect them more closely. The weight of the coins surprised him, and as he turned them over in his hands, he noticed that they were covered in intricate designs. They didn't look like anything he had seen before. The markings were unlike anything from his own country, and the metal seemed old, yet strangely well preserved. His fingers brushed over the smooth surface of a small statue, a figure that seemed to represent a human-like form, but with features that were unfamiliar. The face was expressive, the eyes wide and round, and the body was thin and elegant. John couldn't help but feel a sense of reverence for the artifact in his hands. It was a treasure, no doubt, but it was more than that. It was a link to a past that he could barely understand, a past that had somehow been buried beneath the earth all this time. He continued to scan the area around him. The more he looked, the more he realized that the sinkhole wasn't just a hole in the ground. It was a time capsule holding pieces of history that had been hidden for centuries. As John moved deeper into the hole, he saw other objects, more coins, small tools, and other fragments of what appeared to be jewelry. Some of the coins were scattered in neat little piles, as if they had been carefully placed there, but over time the earth had shifted them into disarray. John's thoughts raced. What was he supposed to do with this discovery? The farmer in him knew that these items had to be valuable, but the part of him that respected history, that understood the importance of preserving the past, felt a deeper responsibility. This wasn't just about finding something worth money, it was about finding something that belonged to the world, to everyone. He knew he couldn't just keep the items for himself. This was bigger than him. His mind began to race with questions. Who had buried these treasures here? How had they ended up in his field? The more he thought about it, the more questions popped up. Had there been a hidden civilization here long ago? Had this area once been home to a thriving community, and if so, what had happened to them? The mystery of it all began to feel overwhelming, but John knew that he couldn't let himself get lost in the questions. He had to act, and he had to act quickly. The first thing that crossed his mind was to contact someone, an expert, perhaps an archaeologist or historian. But who could he trust? What if people didn't believe him? The idea of having the discovery dismissed as a mere accident made his stomach turn. He had to find someone who would take him seriously, someone who would understand the significance of what he had found. But how would he even begin to explain something so unbelievable? John carefully placed the coins and the small statue into a small bag he had brought with him. He didn't want to disturb the area too much, but he knew he needed to take samples back with him. He felt an overwhelming sense of urgency. If these artifacts were as important as they seemed, someone needed to see them before they were lost forever. The storm that had caused the sinkhole was only the beginning of the damage. Who knew what other forces might be at play in the future? He needed to secure these items before they were destroyed or lost to time again. As he carefully climbed back up the rope, John's mind raced with the possibilities. What would the world say about his discovery? What if he was the one who uncovered something that could change history? His heart thudded in his chest as he reached the top, pulling himself over the edge of the sinkhole and back onto solid ground. The sunlight seemed brighter now, and the world outside the sinkhole felt strangely distant, as though he had just stepped out of a time machine. John walked slowly back to the farmhouse, still clutching the bag with the artifacts. He knew he had to contact someone, but he wasn't sure who yet. He considered calling the local authorities, but he worried they wouldn't take him seriously. Perhaps he could reach out to a museum or even a university. He needed an expert, someone who could tell him if he had just uncovered a treasure trove or if he was simply overreacting. By the time John reached the farmhouse, the afternoon sun was beginning to set. He sat down at the kitchen table, his hands trembling slightly as he unpacked the items from the bag. The coins shimmered in the light, their designs intricate and mysterious. The small statue sat quietly on the table, its eyes seeming to follow him as if it had a story to tell. John studied the objects carefully, feeling a growing sense of wonder. These were not just random pieces of metal and stone, they were something far more significant. For hours, John sat at the table, turning the objects over in his hands, deep in thought. He had never been one for books or history classes, but he knew enough to understand that these artifacts weren't ordinary. They were valuable, yes, but they were also meaningful. They represented something from the past, a past that had been lost and forgotten until now. John knew he couldn't keep this discovery to himself for much longer. He had to share it with the world. But as he thought about the implications of what he had found, he began to wonder about the possible consequences. What if someone tried to take the artifacts from him? What if others came looking for the treasure? His heart pounded at the thought of losing what he had worked so hard to uncover. That night, John barely slept. His mind raced with thoughts of the sinkhole, the artifacts, and the future. He knew he had to act, but he wasn't sure what steps to take. He could feel the weight of the discovery pressing down on him. He had uncovered something that could change his life, but he also realized that it could change the world. The responsibility of it all was both thrilling and terrifying. The next morning, John woke up early, determined to make a decision. He couldn't wait any longer. He needed to contact someone who would know what to do. As he sipped his coffee and looked out over his farm, he realized that this discovery had the power to change everything. The farm, which had been struggling for so long, could now be the key to something greater. And John knew that whatever came next, he would have to navigate it carefully. His life, and perhaps the world's understanding of history, had just been forever altered. The next few days were a blur of activity for John. He couldn't shake the feeling that his life had changed forever. The artifacts he had found in the sinkhole were unlike anything he had ever imagined. The more he thought about them, the more he realized how important they were. But he also knew that he couldn't figure this out alone. He needed someone who could help him make sense of the discovery, someone who would know what to do with such rare and ancient pieces. John spent the next day gathering his thoughts and preparing to make a phone call. He had already thought about a few people he could contact, but he wasn't sure who would take him seriously. His mind kept racing back to the relics, the coins, the statue, and the other pieces he had found. He had kept them safe, tucked away in a small chest in the corner of his living room. He could hardly believe they were his, but they were. The weight of the discovery felt overwhelming. Finally, he decided to call Dr. Emily Carter, a local archaeologist who had worked with the nearby university for many years. He remembered seeing her name in the local papers, and he knew she had worked on a few excavations in the area. If anyone could help him, it would be her. He took a deep breath and dialed the number. "Hello, Dr. Carter speaking," a calm voice answered on the other end of the line. John hesitated for a moment. "Hi, my name is John Maxwell. I live just outside town and I found something. Well, something unusual on my farm. I think it might be important, and I was wondering if you could take a look at it." There was a pause before Dr. Carter responded. "What sort of thing did you find, Mr. Maxwell?" John explained briefly about the storm, the sinkhole, and the artifacts he had discovered. As he spoke, he could hear the intrigue in Dr. Carter's voice growing. She asked for more details, and John described the coins, the pottery, and the statue as best as he could. When he mentioned that some of the coins had unusual designs, he could hear Dr. Carter's interest spike even further. "Could I come and take a look at them? If you don't mind, of course," she asked, her tone now full of excitement. John agreed immediately, setting a time for the next morning. The night passed slowly, and he hardly slept. He spent hours looking over the artifacts again, trying to imagine where they had come from, who had made them, and why they had been buried in the ground for so long. The more he thought about it, the more questions he had. And yet there was something about the artifacts that felt almost sacred, like they were meant to be found. The next morning, Dr. Carter arrived right on time. She was a tall woman with sharp eyes and a calm demeanor. As she stepped out of her car, John couldn't help but notice the professional air she carried. She had worked on digs in other parts of the country, and John could see the knowledge in her every step. He led her to the farmhouse, where he had laid out the artifacts on a table for her to examine. Dr. Carter immediately began inspecting the items, her fingers delicately tracing over the designs on the coins and the texture of the pottery. She seemed lost in thought, taking notes as she worked. John stood off to the side, watching her carefully. He felt both excited and nervous, unsure of what her verdict would be. After several minutes, Dr. Carter stopped and turned to him. Her face was serious, but there was a glimmer of excitement in her eyes. "Mr. Maxwell," she began, "these objects are extraordinary. I can tell you right now that they are not from any period I've seen locally before. These coins, the symbols on them, they don't belong to any known civilization from this region." John felt his heart race. "So they're valuable?" Dr. Carter nodded. "They are much more than valuable. These artifacts could be from a civilization we didn't even know existed in this part of the world. I would need to analyze them further, but I'm certain these are not modern items. They are ancient." John's mind raced. The idea of these objects belonging to an ancient civilization was almost too much to comprehend. "So, what do we do now?" Dr. Carter's eyes softened. "The first step is to preserve these items properly. They are fragile, and if they are left out in the open for too long, they could deteriorate. I recommend we carefully document everything, photograph each piece, and then, if you agree, I'll bring in some of my colleagues from the university. We need to get a full analysis on them." John nodded, eager to help in any way he could. He had already realized that he could never have figured this out alone, and he was glad to have Dr. Carter's expertise on his side. As she began to carefully pack up the items, John thought back to the moment when he had first discovered the sinkhole. It had felt like a random event at the time, a natural disaster that had disrupted his life. But now it seemed like fate had played a hand in leading him to this incredible discovery. Over the next few days, Dr. Carter worked tirelessly, bringing in a team of experts from the university. They carefully examined every artifact, running tests and studying the markings on the coins. The more they learned, the more they were able to piece together the history behind the items. They confirmed that the artifacts were from a previously unknown civilization, one that had lived in the area hundreds, if not thousands, of years ago. John could hardly believe what was happening. His farm, once a place of struggle, had now become the site of an archaeological breakthrough. The discovery was making headlines, and soon, reporters from all over the region were calling, eager to learn more about the artifacts and the man who had found them. John had never wanted fame, but he knew that this was his moment, the moment when everything changed. As the weeks went by, the site became a place of excavation, with experts carefully digging around the sinkhole, uncovering more treasures hidden beneath the surface. John's once quiet farm was now a place of constant activity, as researchers, archaeologists, and journalists came and went. His life had been turned upside down, but in ways he never could have imagined. Despite the growing excitement, John remained grounded. He had always been a simple farmer, and he knew the value of hard work. But he also knew that what he had found was something truly special. It was a link to the past, a treasure that had been hidden for centuries, waiting for someone to find it. And now it was in his hands. As the days passed, the discovery on John Maxwell's farm began to take on a life of its own. What had started as a curious find in a sinkhole had turned into something much bigger. The artifacts were now in the hands of experts, and the world seemed to be watching with bated breath. John never could have imagined that his quiet, humble life as a farmer would lead to such a monumental discovery. But as exciting as it was, it came with challenges he hadn't anticipated. Soon, the local authorities became involved. News of the find had spread far beyond the small town where John lived, and it wasn't long before the government took notice. Officials began visiting the site, asking questions and taking photographs. John had expected the media attention. After all, it was a groundbreaking discovery, but he hadn't anticipated the legal complexities that would arise from it. The first phone call came from a government official, a man named Charles Thomas, who introduced himself as a representative of the National Heritage Department. "Mr. Maxwell," he said, "we need to discuss the ownership of the artifacts you discovered. These items are of historical significance, and as such, they are subject to national laws regarding heritage preservation." John felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He had known that the artifacts were valuable, but he hadn't considered the legal implications. He wasn't sure how much control he had over them, or even if he would be allowed to keep them. The idea of losing them was unbearable, but he also understood that they belonged to history, not just to him. "Mr. Maxwell," Charles continued, "I understand that this is a difficult situation, but these artifacts are not just part of your farm, they are part of the country's history. We will need to work out an agreement about their care and ownership." John nodded, though Charles couldn't see it. "I understand," he replied, "but they were found on my land. I've worked this farm for years, and I've put everything I have into it. I never expected to find something like this. I want to do the right thing, but I also want to make sure that the farm and I are taken care of." The conversation was tense, and John knew that this was just the beginning of the complicated process. Charles explained that the government would be sending legal experts to discuss the matter further. They would need to determine whether John had any claim to the artifacts, or if they would be considered the property of the state. John's mind raced. What if he lost everything? What if the government took the artifacts and left him with nothing? Over the next few weeks, things became increasingly complicated. The experts and archaeologists continued to work on the site, uncovering more artifacts and pieces of history buried in the earth. The attention grew, and John's farm became a place of constant activity. Media crews arrived from all over the country, eager to document the discovery. Reporters asked questions, photographers snapped pictures, and John found himself constantly surrounded by people he didn't know. It was overwhelming, and the pressure to handle the situation responsibly began to weigh on him. John found himself torn. On the one hand, he was proud of what he had found. The artifacts had brought attention to his farm, and his life had been turned upside down in ways he could hardly comprehend. But on the other hand, he felt a growing sense of loss. His quiet, private life was no longer his own. He had become a public figure, and everything was changing too quickly. One afternoon, as John sat at his kitchen table, his thoughts were interrupted by another phone call. It was from a lawyer who represented the state. "Mr. Maxwell," the lawyer began, "I'd like to discuss the possibility of a formal agreement regarding the artifacts you found. We believe that these items are of significant historical importance, and as such, they are subject to legal protection. However, we are willing to work with you on a fair arrangement." John listened carefully, his mind still reeling from everything that had happened. The lawyer explained that the state would likely offer compensation for the artifacts, but it would be a fraction of their true value. John felt his heart sink. Was this what he had worked so hard for? Was this the price he would have to pay for being the one to find them? I understand, John said quietly, trying to keep his emotions in check. But I want to make sure that I am treated fairly. This farm, these artifacts, they are all I have. The lawyer assured him that they would make sure to offer a fair deal, but the words felt hollow to John. He had worked his entire life to make the farm a success, and now it felt like everything was slipping away. He couldn't help but feel betrayed, even though he knew the law was on the side of the state. These were historical treasures, after all, and the government had every right to protect them. As the legal discussions dragged on, John found himself becoming more and more frustrated. He felt like a pawn in a game that he didn't fully understand. Every decision seemed to be out of his control, and the people around him seemed to be more concerned with the artifacts than with his well-being. Then, one day, he received an unexpected visit from Dr. Emily Carter. She had been working tirelessly on analyzing the artifacts and coordinating with the university to determine their origins. She had become a close ally in the midst of the legal chaos. When she arrived at John's farmhouse, her face was more serious than he had ever seen it. "John," she began, "I've been thinking a lot about everything that's been happening. I know this is difficult, but I think we need to have a serious conversation about your future and the future of the artifacts." John looked at her, his face tired and worn from the stress. "What do you mean?" he asked. Dr. Carter sat down at the table, her voice low and calm. "These artifacts are a once-in-a-lifetime discovery. They have the potential to change everything we know about the history of this region. But more than that, they have the power to change your life. You've been thrust into a situation that no one could have predicted, but you can take control of it. You don't have to just accept what others decide for you. You have options." John listened intently, his heart lifting slightly. For the first time in weeks, he felt like there was a way forward. Dr. Carter continued, "Have you considered negotiating with the state? Not just about compensation, but about securing your role in the ongoing work with the artifacts. This farm is where it all began, and it could be the place where history is rewritten. You could work with us, with the university, to ensure that your involvement is recognized, not just as the finder of the artifacts, but as someone who played a key role in uncovering the truth." John sat in silence for a moment, the weight of her words sinking in. Maybe this wasn't the end of everything. Maybe it was the beginning of something new, something that could benefit not just him, but the entire community. The more he thought about it, the more it made sense. He could be part of something bigger than himself, something that would leave a legacy for future generations. "Maybe you're right," John said slowly. "Maybe I don't have to lose everything. Maybe I can turn this into something that helps me and helps everyone else too." Dr. Carter smiled, a small but knowing smile. "Exactly. You've already made an incredible discovery. Now it's time to make sure it works for you." The weeks following John's conversation with Dr. Carter were filled with a whirlwind of activity. With a renewed sense of purpose, he dove headfirst into managing the situation that had so drastically changed his life. The weight of the legal negotiations was still heavy, but now he felt more confident. Instead of letting things happen to him, he was taking control of his future. He wasn't just a farmer anymore, he was a key figure in an incredible discovery, one that could change history. Dr. Carter and the team from the university had become a regular part of his life. They came and went, studying the artifacts, carefully analyzing every piece, and working with local officials to ensure that the proper steps were taken to preserve them. John was right there with them, lending his knowledge of the land and the history of the area. It felt good to be part of something so significant. For the first time in years, John felt a sense of pride and excitement about his farm. The thought of it as a simple piece of land, just for growing crops and raising animals, felt distant. Now it was a place of history, a place where the past and future collided. During one of the many discussions with Dr. Carter, she mentioned that the artifacts were already attracting the attention of archaeologists and historians from across the country. John was slowly becoming a local celebrity, known not only for his discovery, but for his efforts to work with experts to ensure the site was properly protected. The media had caught wind of it, and while the attention was overwhelming at times, John didn't mind. He had been thrust into the spotlight, but he was determined to make sure the story was told right, not just for his own benefit, but for everyone who had helped him along the way. But the attention was not always positive. As news of the discovery spread, It wasn't long before private collectors began calling, offering large sums of money for the artifacts. Some wanted to buy them outright, others offered to sponsor excavations on the land in exchange for ownership of the items. It was tempting. The offers were substantial, far more than John had ever dreamed of, but each time he refused. He had made a decision these artifacts weren't for sale. They belonged to history, and he had to respect that. The government officials were also relentless. They had made it clear that they wanted to take control of the site. The legal team sent to him seemed focused solely on securing the artifacts for the state, offering him compensation but not much else. They were kind enough, but John knew what they wanted, the artifacts for public preservation. The more they pushed, the more John felt as though they were disregarding his role in the discovery. He was no longer just a farmer, he was an integral part of this story. He wasn't going to let that slip away so easily. John spent hours on the phone with his lawyer, discussing his rights, the possibilities for compensation, and most importantly, the role he could play in preserving the discovery. He learned about the legal protections in place for archaeological finds and began to feel more empowered. He wasn't going to let the government or anyone else take the artifacts from his farm without fair consideration. After all, it was his land, his discovery, and his future. As the months went by, John's life began to change in ways he hadn't expected. He had made a name for himself, not just as a farmer, but as a caretaker of history. His farm became a point of interest for scholars and historians, all eager to learn more about the mysterious civilization that had once called this land home. The excavations continued, and the team discovered even more artifacts hidden beneath the surface: pottery, tools, jewelry, and ancient weapons. It was as if the earth was giving up its secrets, one layer at a time. But despite the excitement surrounding the discoveries, John couldn't ignore the fact that there were still challenges ahead. The legal battles were ongoing, and the pressure to settle with the government was growing. Some days it felt as though he was caught in the middle, torn between what he knew was right for the artifacts and what he needed for his future. The emotional toll was heavy, but John was resolute. He had come this far, and he wasn't going to give up now. One day, a letter arrived at John's farmhouse. It was from the government, but it wasn't the typical legal document he had grown accustomed to. This letter was different. It outlined a proposal, a partnership between John, the state, and the university. The government offered to fund further excavations on the property, but in exchange, John would be granted a permanent role as the site's official overseer. He would be compensated for his involvement, and the farm would receive a portion of the proceeds from any future discoveries. John sat down at the kitchen table, reading the letter over and over again. It was an offer he had never imagined. It was fair, respectful of his contributions, and it ensured that he would remain a part of the process moving forward. The thought of being involved in the ongoing excavation, of seeing the project through to its conclusion, filled him with pride. It was the chance of a lifetime, a chance to leave a legacy. After carefully considering the offer, John made his decision. He accepted the proposal. He would continue to work with the experts, help preserve the history that had been uncovered, and ensure that the artifacts remained protected for future generations. It was the right choice, not just for him, but for the farm and for the town that had supported him all along. Over the next few months, the excavation site became a bustling hub of activity. John worked closely with Dr. Carter and the team from the university, overseeing the site's progress and ensuring that everything was done with care and respect for the land. The work was hard, but John felt a deep sense of satisfaction in knowing that he was a part of something much larger than himself. The farm, which had once been a place of struggle, was now a place of hope, a place where history was being written every day. The media coverage continued, but it was no longer overwhelming. John had found a balance, and he had learned to navigate the attention with grace. He was no longer just a farmer, he was a protector of history. And as the excavation site grew, so did his reputation as someone who valued the past while looking toward the future. Years passed, and the discoveries continued. The artifacts found on John's farm helped scholars piece together a forgotten history, one that had been buried beneath the soil for centuries. The land became a symbol of perseverance, of the importance of preserving the past, and of the power of a single discovery to change the course of history. John's life had changed in ways he could never have imagined. From a farmer struggling to make ends meet, he had become a key figure in one of the most significant archaeological discoveries of the century. But more than that, he had found something even more valuable than the artifacts themselves. He had found his purpose. He had preserved the legacy of a forgotten civilization, and in doing so, he had secured his place in history. As he stood at the edge of the site, looking out over the land that had once been just a simple farm, John felt a deep sense of gratitude. He had been given the opportunity to do something extraordinary, and he had embraced it fully. The journey had been long, and the road had been difficult, but in the end, it had been worth every step. John Maxwell was no longer just a farmer. He was a keeper of history, and his story would be told for generations to come.